Hello, class. Thank you for viewing my presentation. My name is Spencer Barnett, and I will be discussing the failure of nation building in Afghanistan. I chose this topic as nation building is one of the clearest examples of civil-military relations, as you have an armed force overtly establishing civilian structures and norms. I will be specifically discussing the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and its subsequent attempts to build a stable, democratic nation in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, with appropriate comparisons to successful nation-building attempts in West Germany and Japan post-World War II. Here's an overview of what I will be discussing today. First, I will give a brief introduction, then I will be going over a few key points necessary to understand what nation building is. Next, I will be discussing the 3 key factors needed for nation building. Then I will have a brief conclusion summarizing the arguments presented. The United States of America has a long history of nation building. A 2003 report from the Carnegie Endowment identifies 16 different attempts by the U.S. military to nation build. While the definition of success is different in each scenario, the outcomes are nearly all identical: the failure to maintain a democratic government in the long term. This brings us to the ongoing attempt in Afghanistan. In September of 2001, Al-Qaeda launched 9/11 attacks from Afghanistan, where they were hosted and protected by the Taliban. This prompted the longest war in American history, a conflict that has spanned over 19 years to date, and the most recent attempt to nation build. This report also laid out 3 vital factors necessary for nation building to be successful: the target nation's internal characteristics, a convergence of the geopolitical interests of the outside power in the target nation, and a commitment to economic convergence, the commitment to economic development in the target nation. I will utilize this outline, along with other indicators, to show, when compared with successful nation building in Germany and Japan, why the U.S. attempt at nation building in Afghanistan was a dubious proposition at best, and, more broadly, that while state building is an achievable goal, the much more important nation building is a nearly impossible task. The first step in analyzing nation building is establishing what nation building is, what the similar yet vitally separate concept of state building is, and how the United States seeks to accomplish these 2 ideas. State building is the construction of a state apparatus defined by its monopoly of the legitimate use of violence in a given territory. It can be stated simply as building a government system, and more specifically for the U.S., a democratic system of government. State building has been done by the U.S. many times in its history, in the post-war Axis powers, in South Vietnam, in Iraq, and even Afghanistan. However, it is ultimately a very unimportant accomplishment if it is not accompanied by nation building, which is necessary to ensure the long-term survivability of the state. Nation building is a vague concept and can differ wildly depending on the various circumstances present in the target country. However, a relatively consistent definition is that nation building is the process through which the boundaries of the modern state and those of the national community become congruent. By definition, you must change the very fabric of a society in order to be successful. After the topple of the Taliban, it was not enough to create a democratic government of Afghanistan. The U.S. military needed to create Afghan culture and unity by combining its incredibly fragmented parts. The internal characteristics of a country are the most important to consider when looking through the lens of nation building. Of its internal characteristics, a country's most important factors to possess in order to be a success is that it possesses a strong national identity and an effective state capacity. When looking at the 2 most prominent historical examples of success in nation building, Japan and Germany in the aftermath of World War II, you can see that they had very strong senses of national identity. Before the rise and fall of the Third Reich in Germany, there had been historic trends of Germanic people uniting into common governments from the Middle Ages up until the Weimar Republic. In addition to this political cohesion, there was strong ethnic cohesion as well. Prior to the 1950s, there were very few ethnic minorities in Germany, except for Jews, whose population was decimated during the Holocaust. In Japan, the sense of national unity was even more deeply rooted, with some version of a Japanese government having existed since the Yamato clan was the ruling group in the 5th century CE. For both of these countries, there were strong ethnic ties to a centralized nation, along with a historical acceptance of some form of state government. This is not the case in Afghanistan. Afghanistan historically was under the rule of many various empires, not really becoming an independent state until 1747, and even after was often a pawn used by various colonial powers. Perhaps more significantly, the concept of an Afghan is ambiguous at best. There are a large number of ethnic backgrounds held by Afghan citizens, none forming a majority. When nation-building attempts were just getting underway in the early 2000s, the largest ethnic group were the Pashtuns, which are around 38%, followed by the Tajiks at 25%, Hazaras at 19%, and many other smaller groups such as the Uzbeks, Imaks, Turkmen, and others. While ethnic diversity is certainly not an inherently bad thing, when it comes to nation building, it can create huge divides between various people who the outside power is attempting to bring together. Especially in a country as geographically widespread as Afghanistan, there is very little connecting the Pashtuns and the Hazaras in their various regions. On top of these ethnic divisions, Afghanistan is a tribal society made up of dozens of different tribes with historic relationships, rivalries, unities, and divisions between them. There are also linguistic, geographic, religious, and other divisions. All of this is to say that there is very little uniting the various peoples of Afghanistan, and trying to force them into one unified government is a monumental task that is inclined to fail. As Pei and Casper identify, fragmented countries pose extraordinary challenges to nation builders because, lacking a common national identity, various ethnic groups, along with tribal, religious, and others in Afghanistan, particularly those long oppressed, tend to seize the rare opportunity of outsiders' intervention to seek complete independence or gain more power. This can trigger national disintegration or a backlash from other ethnic groups, with the outside powers caught in the middle. The target of nation building must have a strong state capacity, which includes the organizational effectiveness and discipline of its military, bureaucracy, and judiciary. After World War II, the United States and its allies decided against dismantling the German and Japanese government structures, and instead modified them to adhere to democratic rule. In Japan, for example, out of 2.5 million cases investigated, only 40,000, fewer than 2%, of the politicians, bureaucrats, and business people with ties to the old regime were purged from power. In contrast, before the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, the country was largely agrarian and fractured, with no unified, nationally agreed-upon government existing since before the Mujahideen revolted in the late 70s. Because of the ethnic, political, societal, and geographic divides in Afghanistan, nothing resembling a strong state capacity had existed before the installation of the Hamid Karzai presidency. The U.S. goals laid out in the 2001 Bonn Agreement of a strong centralized government run counter to the historical model of what has worked in Afghanistan. In its most stable modern iteration under the monarchy of the 1930s and 1950s, Afghanistan's government had limited reach and power and relied instead on local leaders to run and maintain the various sectors of the country. The central government aimed to only keep the peace, administer justice, see that conscription went smoothly, and collect small amounts of taxes. This model resulted in a period of stability and peace, the likes of which Afghanistan has not seen since. Yet despite this proven model of success laying in front of the U.S. and other nations seeking to nation build in Afghanistan, they instead chose to build completely new institutions, norms, and regulations from the ground up. It should come as no surprise that the result of this effort is a government which is widely viewed as corrupt, with 81.5% of respondents in 2009 saying corruption is a major problem, and another 15.6% saying it is a minor problem. The election in 2019, when the runner-up Abdullah declared the results to be fraudulent and established his own opposition government, amplified the deep-seated beliefs held by many that the government and elections in Kabul are corrupt and fraudulent. Corruption also plays a role in how security forces throughout the country are viewed. The Afghan Local Police, which is an organization backed by the U.S. Special Operations Force that was intended to create, train, and arm local units that could defend their own neighborhoods against the Taliban and other military groups, has been quite effective in many areas, most notably in its counterinsurgency efforts, largely due to the fact that it is comprised of local citizens who can identify with the people they are protecting. But it has also created huge problems in some areas where instead of being described as an indispensable source of protection without which their districts would have become battlegrounds or insurgency havens, it is more common to hear complaints that the ALP prey upon the people they are supposed to guard, with abuses of power such as extortion being a chief complaint. The ALP, due to being a local militia with very little oversight, is also often co-opted by local warlords and leaders for use as a private military. This is an issue which brings to mind the question of who is serving in the Afghan armed forces and in what capacity. While the ALP is viewed positively in many places due to its members' attachment to its homes and people, its lack of structure and oversight leave it vulnerable to abuse. In contrast, the Afghan National Army, or ANA, is composed with a standardized chain of command and oversight from civilian leaders, but it lacks the ability to match its soldiers with assignments they are able to carry out, usually because the U.S. and Afghan leadership was sending them into rural communities that treated them as outsiders because of their tribe, ethnicity, or urban background. To try and correct these issues, Kabul, following the recommendation of leaders in Washington, has instituted an ethnic quota for its officer corps, roughly along the lines of the population's ethnic composition. However, the government does not actually track this data, so whether its quotas are being met is uncertain. There's also no quota about the ethnic composition of the enlisted soldiers, which results in the effect laid out earlier of Afghans feeling like outsiders in various regions. A correction to the lack of ethnic balancing could prove beneficial in establishing the ANA as a more legitimate force in the ethnically diverse regions of Afghanistan. This has been proven successful in other regions that have fragmented populations, such as in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where ethnic balancing in the armed forces has brought about a strong military that can be seen as a unifying symbol between differing peoples. The next aspect of nation building that is important is the convergence of the geopolitical interests of the outside power and the target nation. In our successful examples of Germany and Japan, we can clearly see why the American commitment to building strong democratic nations was so high. The world was bifurcated between the two global powers of the United States and the Soviet Union. While the split between West and Eastern Germany, the plan for Germany and German industry was to be rebuilt in order to assure a strong ally for the United States on the front lines of the Iron Curtain, and to ensure the long-term survivability of European industry as a whole. The introduction of the Marshall Plan showed a long-term commitment to rebuilding not just democracy in Germany, but also industry, infrastructure, trade, and more. The goals from the 1940s up until the reunification of Germany were consistent: rebuild Germany into an economic power to stop the advance of Soviet communism. In Japan, this was even more direct, with General Douglas MacArthur acting as the de facto leader of the country. The threat of communism spread enabled the American public to throw their whole weight behind the nation-building projects in West Germany and Japan. In Afghanistan, there have been mixed opinions about U.S. involvement. Initially, there was high support for the war effort, with an October 2001 poll finding that 90% of U.S. citizens supported military action in Afghanistan. However, this has waned the longer the U.S. has been involved. In September of 2010, only 41% of Americans approved the war. And in 2018, 70% of Americans say it was not a good idea to send troops to Afghanistan in 2001. Another issue of American interests have been the changing goals of the war in Afghanistan. Initially, President Bush's goals were, quote, to destroy al-Qaeda and the Taliban government that protected it, and to ensure the country wouldn't be a safe haven for terrorists, end quote. This goal has since evolved into establishing Afghanistan as a stable democracy. As the Harvard Political Review stated, quote, the lack of a long-term strategy was a critical factor that prolonged the war in Afghanistan. With changing objectives, no clear endpoint, and arbitrary timetables, the United States was not positioned for success. However, that was redefined throughout the conflict, end quote. By not having a pre-established goal that was consistently strived for, the goalposts of success in Afghanistan have been constantly moving, providing new challenges for the U.S. military and its allies in the region. Another issue is ensuring the goals of local Afghans are met and aligned with U.S. interests. One of the largest and most obvious ways that the U.S. goals and local goals diverge is the setup of the government system in Afghanistan. As discussed earlier, the U.S. goal of a strong centralized government runs counter to what is desired by Afghans and what has historically worked. This is an issue that also goes back to the many cleavages in the Afghan population. Many Afghans feel disillusioned with the direction of the country. 61% of respondents say the country is going in the right direction. And this is not consistent across ethnic divisions, with almost 50% of Pashtuns believing the country is headed in the correct division, but no other ethnic group is above 30%. This local societal differences in Afghanistan, along with the disconnect between American-Afghan goals, point to there not being a convergence of compelling strategic interests. The third characteristic needed for successful nation building is a commitment to economic development in the target nation. As mentioned earlier, in the post-World War II era in West Germany and Japan, the United States made long-term commitments to the reconstructions of German and Japanese industries and societies. And these nations, largely due to their already existing state capacity, were able to utilize this economic support to rebuild their countries. In Afghanistan, the commitment to long-term economic development has indeed been present, with the American government alone spending $932 billion since 2001 in Afghanistan, its allies and international agencies many billions more. However, one of the largest issues has been, unlike in Germany and Japan, nation building in Afghanistan occurred before the conflict was ended. While the Taliban is no longer the legal government in Afghanistan, they are certainly still present, And as of December 2019, the group has regained much strength and continues to control as much as 40% of the country, with perhaps more than 20 to 40,000 active Taliban fighters still active. The fighting is ongoing in Afghanistan, and as a result, many advances in developing infrastructure are negated due to attacks that destroy some or all of the developments. Another reason for the lack of return on investment could be due to the bureaucracy and military doing a poor job in utilizing the funds. The U.S. military's own infrastructure has degraded to a large degree recently, with 32% of the U.S. military's infrastructure being rated as poor or failing by the Pentagon. If the military cannot maintain its own infrastructure, it should not come as a shock that they are not succeeding in building a foreign nation's infrastructure either. Afghanistan today is one of the poorest and least developed countries in the world. Just over 30% of Afghans have reliable power, only 39% of rural Afghans have safe drinking water, and 55% of Afghans live below the basic needs poverty rate. Its GDP is 170th per capita in the world, one of the lowest rates in the out of all nations. Despite all the money poured in Afghanistan, there has been little economic development. The U.S. involvement in Afghanistan has lasted for nearly 20 years, and yet, despite all that time, very little seems to have been achieved. A government has been put in place, and a national army has been created. However, the Taliban is still present and controlling large swaths of land. The country is fragmented into many various regions with few unifying factors between them. Many Afghans live in fear of harm on a daily basis, and economic progress has been incredibly slow. So while state building has been achieved, it would be quite difficult to successfully argue that the boundaries of the modern state of Afghanistan and those of the national community have become congruent. Nation building in Afghanistan has been on the whole a failure, and the main reason why has been that the internal characteristics of Afghanistan were not amenable to a nation building. The interests of the American government, American population, Afghan government, and Afghan population have not converged, and the economic commitment by the U.S. and others has not been properly utilized. This is a list of my references. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.